All right, well, welcome to the second episode of Cross Aisle Talk. It's a podcast about how BIPOC mental health practitioners and scholars can work together to better support BIPOC communities and each other. My name is Dr. Donna Dimanarig. My background is in clinical psychology, but I am currently working as an assistant professor in the psychology department at the University of Bridgeport. I'm the 2020-2021 LDI Fellow and also the Secretary and Historian for the Asian American Psychological Association. I am very excited for our guest today, Dr. Germine Awad. Dr. Awad is currently an associate professor at the Department of Educational Psychology in the Human Development, Culture, and Learning Sciences program. Her scholarship involved around prejudice and discrimination, identity and acculturation, and more recently, body image among women of color. She has published her works in a handful of journals, including Journal of Black Psychology, The American Psychologist, Journal of Applied Social Psychology, and Cultural Diversity and Ethnic Minority Psychology. She has written two books, Designing and Interpreting Quantitative Research in Multicultural Counseling and The Handbook of Arab American Psychology. The majority of her research is guided by the questions such as what factors lead to discrimination against ethnic minorities and what impacts perceptions of experienced discrimination. Although overt discrimination towards ethnic minorities has decreased over the years, the practice of more covert, subtle forms of prejudice remains. So, Dr. Awad is a recipient of various awards from the University of Texas at Austin, which includes the Summer Research Fellowship in 2010, Outstanding Teacher Award in 2011, and Summer Research Assistant Award in 2012. She also received the Outstanding Teacher Award in 2013 from the Warfield Center for African and African American Studies, Faculty Fellow in 2014 from the Institute for Urban Policy, Research and Analysis, the Emerging Professional Contributions to Research Award in 2014 from the American Psychological Association Division 45, the Evelyn Shakir Nonfiction Book Award in 2016 from the Arab American National Museum, and most recently, the Dean's Outstanding Research Award in 2017 from the College of Education. It's a lot of awards. I'm excited and honored to have Dr. Awad with us as our guest. So, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's an honor to be asked to be here and to talk with you today. Um, yeah. So,
So, this podcast was first started due to the events that started last year. And I'm talking about the COVID 19 that's affected communities of people of color disproportionately, whether it's a lack of access to healthcare and information. Then, of course, with police brutality, the murder of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, and ensuing protests. We are also seeing a rise in anti Asian violence, and most recently in Atlanta, Georgia, where 6 Asian women were killed by a white man. It's clear now more than ever that as a society, as a people, we have a lot of unresolved racial issues, a lot of violence and trauma being inflicted on BIPOC communities. So it was my hope to start a conversation with other BIPOC mental health practitioners and scholars about what we can do to help each other, to build coalition, and to better serve our communities.
yeah, I mean, I think this is such an important podcast and such an important conversation to be having, and one I believe that has been happening for years, but maybe not centered
Mm-hmm.
in terms of really thinking of solutions. And part of the reason I think it hasn't been centered, at least within communities of color, is that unfortunately we're in a society that thinks of um, resources and outcomes as a zero sum game. And people then feel like they have to compete or engage in oppression Olympics
Mm-hmm.
or whatever the case may be. And one of the things that I've sort of talked about with my students over the years is the fact that, we all have different types of things that are happening that contribute to sort of the knowledge and understanding of how racism manifests
Mm-hmm.
in the United States. And for different groups, it looks different. And there might be times where racism towards one group is highlighted more, but that so many groups of color experience racism,
Mm-hmm.
but the way that it manifests is just different. And sometimes the way it manifests can be more invisible than other ways, not only to mainstream society, but to other people of color. So
Mm-hmm.
um, it's really been one of those issues. I think that it's a reoccurring theme, and where we really need to come together to come up with solutions, and also to see one another in terms of what's happening in our lives and our people's lives.
Right. Yeah. Especially with, what's happening or what has happened in Atlanta, Georgia, a couple of days ago. And this police officer, I think the sheriff, had mentioned that the murderer was having a bad day.
Oh, yeah, that's the ultimate form of white privilege.
Mm-hmm.
And it's wow. I mean, I when I heard that, it was infuriating and sadly not surprising. And people, for some reason, in our society, really don't want to have discussions about race and racism. And if they
Mm-hmm.
feel like they mention race, that somehow that's being divisive, not the actual murdering of
Mm-hmm.
6 Asian women as being the problem. But we shouldn't say it's racial because we don't know yet. He just had a fetish, it seems like. And,
Mm.
and I was like, well, that fetish is also racial. So that's still racism. So people have a really weird way of doing a lot of mental gymnastics to not just name racism and oppression when it's happening. And it's unfortunately not uncommon.
Yeah, it kind of actually made me think about post 9/11 and what happened with, that community, the South Asian community, and anybody who looks quote unquote like the terrorists, and what happened to those individuals, those folks, when there was a rise in violence against them.
Right. I mean, and that was really a good example of issues relating to both South Asian, Asian American communities, as well
Mhm.
as Middle Eastern, North African, Arab American, anybody perceived to be Muslim,
Yeah.
given that sort of being perceived as a Muslim is very much racialized.
Hmm.
Um, and essentially, Islamophobia affects anybody that's perceived to be Muslim, meaning brown,
Hmm.
unidentifiable, looking Middle Eastern or Arab, right?
Yeah.
And that was, I think, a really rude awakening for some folks in the Arab and Middle Eastern community. Um, but for others, it was just another reflection of the reality that got much worse after 9/11, because then they were overtly targeted in all of sort of the hate speech,
Yeah.
discrimination, and microaggressions.
Yeah, it seems like every time there is, something big that's happening in our society, back then it was the 9/11, and currently the pandemic, COVID-19, and there's always scapegoating, that occurs. And it's usually BIPOC communities, 9/11, it's these people. During the pandemic, it's these folks. So there's always that scapegoating happening around that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, there's a really great theory, intergroup threat theory, that
Hmm.
talks about symbolic and realistic threats that happen a lot with immigrant communities and those that are perceived to be, quote, foreign to like the
Hmm.
American context. And we see this unfortunately um, play out when there's some sort of tragedy or national event or scapegoating that's happening, most recently with the COVID um, uh, 19 disease, and sort of talking about it as being a China virus, or
Hmm.
all of the different derogatory, horrible ways that,
Right.
you know, it's been sort of referred to, it's just perpetuating some of those terrible prejudices that we know can easily be really brought to light in folks
Mm-hmm.
um, that may have the tendency to sort of see their world in groups and out groups and impose hierarchies
Mm-hmm.
in terms of who they think are worthy and those who they don't think are worthy or foreign or whatever the case may be. So there's so much research to support that this happens all the time
Mm-hmm.
with different issues. You know.
Now, this is a big ask, but in terms of dismantling these types of hierarchies, what do you think we as a society could do, you know, as a step towards starting to dismantle that?
Honestly, I think about this question all the time. And it's a huge problem, so it needs a huge solution,
Mm-hmm.
right? And really multi-leveled solutions. I think there are so many things that could happen, from like a psychological standpoint, where we're looking at maybe intervening with individuals and groups.
Mm-hmm.
I think training white parents about how to talk about race,
Mm-hmm.
racism, and oppression with their children, I think is a huge step. This is my colleague and I are in the process of trying to understand the barriers that white parents have in talking about race with their kids in one of our studies that we hope to carry out in the next few months. And that we argue, that early intervention is important, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you create a society of individuals that think it's important not to be racist, that think egalitarianism is a goal, that think equity should also always be how we're thinking, justice is important, those type of kind of big big picture values, right, that we want to teach children. But then what we see is that children are socialized with the viewpoints of their parents and
Right.
their peers and study. So how do we start kind of infusing, that messaging? And I think so at the same time that we're sort of talking to parents, what also needs to happen is there has to be a top-down process. So what are the policies in place that sort of allow for social justice,
Mm-hmm.
equity, inclusion to occur in organizations and institutions, right? So we know that interventions to reduce racism and discrimination are not going to work if they're not sanctioned by powerful
Right.
authorities.
Right.
And the best way to do that is policy.
Right.
That's why, you know, it's important that people don't, oh, I don't know, get rid of their mask mandates in states,
Right.
things like that,
Right.
because we know that if it's left up to the individual, we have a lot of evidence that they're not making, quote, the right decision.
Mm-hmm.
And so if it's part of our value as a society that we should be anti-racist, actively anti-racist, then that has to come from sanctioned authorities.
Right.
So it could be laws, it
Mm-hmm.
could be institutional policies, school policies, whatever the case may be. But that's really, it's like I said, a huge problem and needs a huge solution that occurs at multiple levels, because one thing isn't going to solve this.
Yeah, and you also mentioned that one of the things that we need to work on are, having white parents talk about race with their children. And I'm wondering, how can we get to those parents who are afraid about talking about race because they don't want to come off as racist themselves? And so they kind of tiptoe around that subject and think of themselves as, I'm not racist. I'm blind to color.
Right. Well, I think that honestly is easier to intervene
Mm,
on compared to parents who are like, I don't care, we are superior. This is
mm,
just the liberal left wing agenda that blah, blah, blah. Like those parents are harder to get at, like
mhm,
get too, right? And those parents really need like policy,
Right,
okay,
right.
to be able to do everything. But the parents that are scared to appear racist are the ones who already think racism is bad. So what you're doing, what you really need to do in that case is educate them about the different ways racism manifests.
Okay.
And one of the ways it manifests is through colorblind racial attitudes. So if you are actually indeed trying to deny that color and race exists, that's a form of racism. And I think just that simple fact for parents who care
Mm-hmm.
about whether or not they're racist, that helps. So really, I know it sounds so Pollyanna, but it is very simplistic. Like it's a simple
Okay.
solution. Education and parents' willingness to be educated, and also time for them to be educated about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when parents understand that, they they really want to learn and find out ways that they could talk to their to their children about race. Like my spouse and my spouse is also a professor. We did so many workshops talking to parents about how to, talk to your kids about race. And I think that what I've learned certainly is that at least where I'm invited and where people ask for it, they really want to understand how to do it. And part of what I talk about in those trainings is this notion that we've been socialized
Mm-hmm.
to not talk about race, and that's a
Right,
problem.
right,
All of us have been, right? So if
right.
someone's like whispering like, oh, I was in this place and I saw this person, and like that person was like, well, I think she was Asian. Like if they're whispering
Right.
racial or pan-ethnic designations, then we see that people are uncomfortable. So
Mm-hmm.
we are embedded in a society in which people don't feel like talking about race is appropriate. And we also see that there are certain entities that take that and call it divisive when you bring up race. And how, not the fact that racism is divisive, but
Right, right.
talking about it is divisive. So um and I think that those parents really, I do believe that there is sometimes an eagerness and a willingness to um, learn about racism, and especially understanding that it's not comfortable and it's okay to be uncomfortable. Like that's
Mm-hmm.
part of it.
Right, yeah. And you mentioned earlier, you talked a little bit about your research, which I know reading your background involves around North African American and Arab and Middle Eastern American communities. In terms of identity, how do you distinguish between North Africans residing in the United States and those who identify as Black or African Americans? Are there any social political distinctions that we need to be mindful about?
That's a really excellent question. And I want to just go on the record to say I don't really personally like the Middle Eastern North African
Mm.
term. It's really a pan-ethnic designation that allows us to use the same language of the census and the Office of Management and Budget in describing
Mm.
North African and Middle Eastern populations, right? And I have a lot of colleagues that sort of talk about it being a colonial term,
Mm.
being problematic, and I agree with those sentiments, absolutely. And I'm also a pragmatist, and I'm also somebody who's been fighting for inclusion of MENA and Arab folks in these spaces
Mhm.
where they're coupled with white.
Mhm.
So I just want to say that MENA I think is a very good good pragmatic term to use, but
Mhm.
it's also just a term um, to help bring together really diverse groups, similar to Asian American, right?
Right, right.
Very similar. So that you bring out together groups that are very diverse in religion and identity and ethnicity and in all these sort of really important ways that people, are different from one another, but that certainly share common characteristics, right? That bring
Okay.
them together. So, you know, I have in my own life have vacillated from, labeling myself as African American, someone who certainly doesn't experience life as a Black woman in the United States, because
Mm.
I certainly don't identify as Black for that reason, because I also don't want to, I want to acknowledge that my experience would not be the same as a Black woman. in the United States. So that's for the reason purposely, that's the purpose. I don't personally identify as Black. However, my ancestry is Black. It is North African. It is so. There are those truths out there, and there are plenty of Black, Arab, and the Middle Eastern and North African folks. So I don't think it's necessarily a political distinction. But I think, there's an acknowledgement that there are, just like there are, Black folks from all different ethnic or pan-ethnic groups. There's, also Black North Africans, of course. And I don't think it's meant to be a distinction from like African American or Black. So, because I know I'm an Egyptian American, so I know a lot of Egyptians identify as African American. So it wasn't really, and that's ironically makes, Egyptian Americans a little bit different than like other Middle Eastern groups that are not connected to Africa. So it's really complicated. I'm sure I made it sound even more complicated, but it's one of those things where there isn't really a clear answer, because identity is in the eye of the beholder.
Right.
It's from what you feel is what you are, really, and that's sort of how I honor people's identity. And I think that's why you may have some folks really not okay with the North Africa taken out of Africa, seemingly in these different categories. And that is certainly a problem. I agree. And I also want to make sure that we are trying to be able to access a group that is completely invisible. Right. So Middle Eastern North Africans are completely just left out of everything. And we don't have our own box and demographic forms, and it's just a huge issue. And so this particular issues that are pertinent to Arab and MENA folks don't get addressed at all, because we don't even count them. So that's why I want the next generation of folks to nitpick on the name. Once we get like the census category, please, by all means, talk about how it's colonial and people can do whatever they want now, but like, that's not my fight. My fight is recognition. And that's, and I'll take it with the very imperfect name of MENA.
It just made me think about, the AAPI community and how it was Asian Americans, and then it was hyphenated at first, and then take out the hyphen. And so we've evolved, and then we've included the PI part. So yeah, identity is very complex. I completely agree with you on that one. And for some reason in our society, we like to simplify that.
Oh, absolutely. Well, that's, I feel like people want to always over categorize, right? We want to over generalize everything. We want everything in a category and nice and neat, and that's not life, and that's not humans.
Exactly.
Like, so it really strips the context. We also know identity is contextual.
Exactly. Yeah. So regarding your early research work, what first led you to pursue your scholarship in this area?
So I have always been interested in prejudice and discrimination and racism ever since I was a kid. And when I got to college, it's what my studies were on, like trying to understand why people stereotype and where prejudice sort of comes from. And I essentially kind of stayed in that area for my whole career. I would say like my everything that I do comes from a place of prejudice, discrimination, and racism, like trying to understand those mechanisms with different outcomes or in different contexts. But that, I would say, is the common thread in my research, because I was, I am an immigrant. My parents came from Egypt when I was a baby. And, the racial landscape of this country is just very interesting. And I am an American. I was raised here. I'm a
Right.
citizen now, and all of that. But also to understand, to truly, put in, you know, Egyptian culture and also American culture, and trying to truly, you're both getting enculturated and
Mhm.
acculturated,
Right.
and you're navigating that, and you really sort of, it gives you a chance to make those comparisons and to understand your world, and that has always sort of been part of what I was doing as even as a child. And racism has always been just so incredibly interesting, and sort of this experience of BIPOC folks in the United
Mhm.
States versus white folks is just so stark and so hard for me to understand as a
Mhm.
kid. And so I just wanted to understand, why do these folks think they're better than these other
Mhm.
folks? Like, it just did not make sense to me at all. Um, and then, obviously I've learned a little bit more now, uh, through the years. But I think, that sort of still drives me. I think really where I am now in my career is trying to look at solutions. So I really trying to shift my research to certainly further understand the mechanisms of prejudice, racism, and discrimination,
Is
but
it
also,
prejudice and racism in towards a particular group, or is it just in general?
so I study not only like prejudice and discrimination towards like minoritized groups. So
Mhm.
I have had students. So I have the pleasure of working with amazing doctoral students, and they have certainly their own research ideas. And some of my students have done work trying to predict prejudice towards um, the LGBT community. Others have focused on particular ethnic minority groups. And so most of my early work certainly focused around Arab American and African American groups.
Okay.
Um, but I really study not only the predictors of prejudice, racism, and discrimination, but I also try to understand how identity impacts the experience of prejudice,
Mhm.
racism, and discrimination. And currently, and this isn't something that's written and down anywhere, but one of the things that I feel like I've had the opportunity to do in my career is really try to understand how the experience of discrimination may differ between different ethnic minority groups or
Yeah.
minoritized groups in the United States. And so right now, I'm working on a, I haven't been working on it this week because it's spring break and I needed a break, um, but essentially comparing how identity and acculturation relate to discrimination, and subsequently anxiety and depression across
Okay.
four different minoritized groups. So Asian American, African American, Arab MENA, and Latinx groups. And
Okay.
so just kind of understanding, are the patterns similar? What's
Mhm.
different? How is it different? And so we're currently in the process of analyzing those data, um, to try to understand, where the common experiences, where
Mhm.
are the experiences that differ a little bit.
That sounds like a very a tough project research project, because I'm even thinking about, even within those groups, I'm sure there is one subgroup that would experience a little bit more currently. I know racism and experiences of racism ebb and flows throughout the years, and I'm just wondering, like, currently I'm sure there are subgroups that would experience it a lot more than the other ones. And um how could we disaggregate that type of data?
Yeah, so I will say that most of these um, data were collected before COVID.
Ah, okay.
So it wouldn't be, and that's a really interesting question. I'm sure that the patterns for, the Asian American participants in my study would totally be different.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, So yeah, I think that's a really good point, and something that also is important to say, like, these are when the data were collected. It wasn't during COVID. Um,
So the good old
just
days.
so, so crazy, and the good old days are what? Where
I know.
Asian Americans are invisible, like
Right.
completely ignored, and the ways that they're like people are xenophobic and
Right.
racist towards them. And yeah, I mean, it's insane, right? So um again, like I said, it's such a common theme. People are like, well, I don't know if this group experiences that much. I'm like, well, here, let's talk about that. Like, this is how this group experiences, that everything that they're dealing with usually is, or most of the things they're dealing with are typically surround immigration, and most of this group deals with stuff typically surrounds like xenophobia and this notion of
Yeah.
foreignness. It's like people are just like, oh yeah, I guess it's different. Yeah, it is. uh, it is different, but I think it's so important to acknowledge that we're all in this fight together, and it
Right.
looks a little different, but it's the same fight.
Right.
And we
Right.
have to fight for one another. And I think this hasn't been more obvious than it is now in the last 2 years of everything that's sort of been happening in the United States. So
I
this
know.
podcast is really timely and important, for
I
sure.
am just so thankful that, I'm a part of the AAPA leadership, and we're working with our, with other ethnic minority organizations. And I know that we're going to be working with Amina Sai as well. So it's just really great to see that type of solidarity, between organizations, because I do think that that's really important to stand together,
Yeah, I
especially this
agree.
time.
Yeah, for sure. It's been so heartbreaking. I yeah, I I was so angry, and usually when I'm angry, I write an op-ed, and I
Yeah.
what I'm trying to figure out is, how do I exalt the voices of my Asian American, my AAPI brothers and sisters. And that's really, I feel like that's part of the issue. Like, we need to just
Mhm.
hold space. This is terrible. And also, it's not up to the Asian American community to fix these problems for themselves. I mean, that's
Thank
also
you.
another thing. Oh, it's like, how do we help you fix your own problems? Like, this is everyone's problem. Everybody needs to fix it. But it's also,
And the
I
ones
know.
in power and controlling the system should fix it.
Right, right. And and I get it. People like are uncomfortable and they don't know how they're supposed to react. And I get
Right.
that. I get it. But you can acknowledge, what a statement isn't everything. It's not going to fix everything, but let's make it to just show
Yeah,
solidarity. Or, we know that. It's just people are so afraid of, like,
I know.
offending. It's like, just do something, say something, be something. It's
Right.
better than doing nothing.
Right. Right.
So,
Because sometimes doing nothing is actually being complicit. So.
absolutely. Absolutely.
So another question I do have: how has discrimination against Arab and Middle Eastern Americans shifted in the past 20 years? We talked a little bit about, post 9/11, and how has that been reflected in terms of your research?
Well, I think, so much of my research in this area, and so I do a lot of, obviously, discrimination
Right.
research. And so I focus on that. And so it's pretty salient that discrimination is still occurring. It certainly ebbs and flows and
Hmm.
doesn't take center stage. But when, certainly 9/11 was a terrible event for everyone. But in addition, you have the Muslim ban
Yep.
that sort of also created a resurgence of discrimination and prejudice. And I think there's a misperception that prejudice towards Arab and Middle Easterners really started at 9/11. And there's been prejudice towards this group since this group came into the United States in the 1890s. So
Mm.
that idea isn't really it doesn't really hold water when we look at some of the evidence.
Right.
Um, And I would say what I've been focused on really is recognition,
Mm-hmm.
this invisibility. So, Arab and Middle Easterners are both invisible and hypervisible simultaneously, right? They're hypervisible in discrimination, in sort of kind of similar issues with foreignness and not
Yeah.
being sort of really American, othering, but then they're invisible in all of these ways in which when we try to account for disparities, they're left out of all of these places in which we collect this information.
Right. Right.
And so that's sort of at the population level that's happening, but then on the individual level you have people looking on a demographic form that we have to fill out for a lot of different reasons all the time, and there's no space for you.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
most of the time not even an other, right? And that's what you
Yeah.
get. The best you get is an other.
Mm-hmm.
So I think um that's really difficult, and it is a form of trauma that is consistent, where you have your people target of hate crimes, target of all of this terrible violence, and there's no way to account for it because people are not even measuring it. um, and so part of the other issues that people automatically assume that when you're talking about Arab and Middle Eastern issues, you're talking about Muslim issues.
Mm-hmm.
And those two things end up becoming conflated all the time, even when you are trying to get sort of measurements
Mm-hmm.
of like, hey, can you ask on your demographic form if there are Arab or Middle Easterners? And they're like, well, we're not really focused on religion, and we're not allowed to collect on religion. I'm like, I didn't ask you to collect on religion. I asked you
Yeah.
to collect on ethnicity and you know, and racial categories. So
Right. Right.
it's really interesting, and so you have this conflation that
Mm-hmm.
occurs that also it causes a lot of confusion for folks. um and you have, like I mentioned earlier, Arab and Middle Easterners, they have this unique experience that even the Christian Arab and Middle
Mm-hmm.
Easterners are experiencing Islamophobia
Right. Right.
because they're being automatically assumed to be Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly Muslims of any background or group should not be discriminated against, right? So
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
it's this common conflation, and certainly individuals who are more visibly have visible markers of Islam are certainly discriminated against at higher rates. Um, but if one of your visible markers is like skin tone
Yeah.
and you look, Arab or Middle Eastern, then people just assume that. I have
Right.
literally told people, what my background is, and they just still assume that it just doesn't. They just cannot disentangle um, religion from ethnicity, and so that's a very unique issue.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to the invisible, that compounds the invisibility issue. So that I would say that Arab and Middle Eastern folks are dealing with, or Arab MENA folks are dealing with in a way that maybe um, some other folks are not dealing with exactly that same
Mm-hmm.
thing, where there's just like no acknowledgement um, of this a conflation and then just complete and utter invisibility.
Yeah, because I do know, based on just experience and talking with folks, is that they do kind of synonymously, like Muslim and you know Arab and Middle Eastern folks, they're the same thing. And I'm thinking, wait
Right.
a minute, no, it's not, because I know Christian Egyptian Americans. So
Right.
that doesn't make that, yeah, that doesn't compute. But yeah, you're right, that happens a lot, and I feel like it does start from the very top. It starts with, even our census here in the United States. It starts with all of that, these little things that is kind of normalized in our culture.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I've worked with the census for a few years now
Mm-hmm.
about adding a box, a category. And, the Census Bureau itself wants to add a MENA category. It
Mm.
is not the census, it's the Office of Management and Budget. The
uh
Office of Management and Budget makes all those decisions about not only minimal racial and ethnicity reporting requirements,
mm-hmm.
but also what the census is allowed to collect data on, period. Okay. And so I was working with a group of scholars and activists with the census since 2011
Mm-hmm.
to try to add this box. And I was brought on
Did you say
to
since
this
2011?
2011.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, this
Okay.
issue's been worked on since the early 90s. So
Oh
just
my gosh.
I
Okay.
came in later than a lot of folks. But so I was brought in because I was doing identity work in this,
Mm-hmm.
and I was really early in my career, and I just happened to luckily run into somebody that was just got hired by the census as their Arab ancestry expert.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I was invited to this North African summit for measuring North African and Middle Eastern populations. And we've been working with the census to try to come up with ways of testing a category. So in 2015, our efforts worked and they tested a Middle Eastern North African category on the national concept test. Okay.
Okay.
They found that when there is a MENA category, people who have a MENA background check it off. Especially, when they have the choice, they choose it over white. Okay. I know it sounds
Mm-hmm.
simple and obvious, but they needed these data. Okay,
Right.
fine. So National Content Test came out with these data. Then they made recommendations. You know what? We need a MENA category. So they sent it over to Office of Management and Budget.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in 2017 was when the operational deadline was. So
Mm.
if you can think about, what's happening in the US at the time,
Yep.
we have a particular administration that,
Right.
is a problem in so many ways, right? So then apparently what ended up happening was that the Office of Management and Budget missed the operational deadline for the census, and therefore a MENA category was not added, and they
Oh my
essentially made really
gosh.
minor changes, actually made changes to just spit into the face of the people who are doing this work by saying like, oh yeah, is this a problem? We'll just like add Lebanese and Egyptian as an example of white in the white category so that people know that's what they should be checking off. Yeah, it's insane. So that happened, all because the Trump administration essentially purposefully missed the deadline and made no decision on it.
Wow.
So yeah, that was hard for the group of us
Yeah.
that were working on this
Yeah.
issue. Um, and Biden did say that he is wanting to revisit it and add a category. However, the way politics works is it depends on who's in power at the time where they're going to make these decisions again.
Mm-hmm.
So the Office of Management and Budget. So unless they make it quickly, it's going to be the same issue. So not to sound very, I have to protect my heart in this issue because
Mm-hmm.
I was hurt the first time working so hard as like a scholar, and like
Right.
there's but then politics gets in the way and stops it. So yeah, it's pretty insane. And part of the reason that I was, this is like off the record in terms of people telling me things that have some power, where one of the main reasons they didn't want to add MENA categories that they didn't want to reduce the number of whites in the United States because it would take
I
MENA
figured
out of
that.
white,
Yeah, I figured as
right?
much.
And that was also the reason why there wasn't a streamlined question for the Latinx group. So that what they were going to do is make recommendations that race and ethnicity should be streamlined into one question so that people can like check off a pan ethnic or racial designation, and then under that either check off or write in their specific ethnic group. And if they felt like if they did that, they would have lost also Latinx folks out of the white category, when they sort of, if you took away just the ethnicity only question. So it's a whole pretty
Mm.
gross thing happening out there.
Huh. That actually boils my
I know,
blood.
I'm so sorry.
Don't be sorry.
Yeah, it's funny because I was so fortunate to be in these spaces where like
Right.
to understand even what was happening with folks that were privy to this information. And because I, of course, am also very pushy. And I was like, please just tell me what happened. I just want to understand what happened. Like, what was the reason? And, and I heard from two pretty, high level folks in the government that this is what happened. And, and politics strikes
Politics is
again.
disgusting.
It really is. Really is.
Just listen to the experts,
Ooh, I know. And the census was upset. They were upset because that study cost $7.8 million that was thrown out. The data were thrown, like it wasn't used.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's taxpayer money not used. So it's insane.
And they complain about, oh, we don't want to use taxpayers' money for this. But look at this. It's such a waste.
Right.
Okay. I'm good. I just had the energy because I was listening and watching the Judiciary Committee. I don't know if you saw that.
I did.
Okay. There was a lot of pent up energy from that.
Yeah, I mean, some of the things were so great that were said, and then
there's
people
just
using
the data that one particular senator was, and the data that he was saying was just that he was justifying his racist rhetoric and using this data to back it up, even though I'm thinking, wait a minute, that data is not even disaggregated. You cannot just say, well, they're only experiencing what was that, 4% of Asian Americans are experiencing hate crimes only.
Right. I mean, yeah, exactly.
Anyway, thank you for your patience. I apologize for that technical issue. So my next question, how does acculturation impact the mental health of North African American and Arab Middle Eastern American populations?
I think that's a really great question. And I feel like studies look differently. The findings kind of depend. I mean, I've seen studies that show, the more acculturated folks are, the better their mental health outcomes. But I've also done my own study where I found that the more acculturated Arab and MENA folks were, the more likely they were to experience discrimination or report discrimination.
Right.
And as a result, we know discrimination is highly correlated with mental and physical health outcomes.
Right.
So I don't know. I think it really depends on what the question is. If we think about like adjusting and reducing like acculturation stress, certainly that's good. Like if you have low levels of acculturation stress, but I think, what I found in my research is that we see the patterns very similar to other minoritized ethnic groups. And that I haven't really seen. So that's part of like the evidence I use to say, hey, this group has like an ethnic minority experience. Please like do something for them. And so what I do a lot is compare with other groups in terms of how it functions, at least with mental and physical health outcomes. And we see a lot of similarities. And so I think the patterns are actually pretty similar to other groups.
And I know that most recently you've been really getting into beauty and body image concerns, especially for women of color. And I'm just wondering what led you to your interest in this particular area?
Yeah, it's really interesting because it wasn't something that I had set out to do. And I keep on saying more recently, but it's probably since like 2005. And that's still recent in my head. But basically it was when I was working at a liberal arts college, and I had so many women, it was all women's college. I had so many women wanting to do like body image. And I had like the 3 women of color that were in this institution wanted to work with women of color. And I was like, ooh, these measures are not created for women of color.
Mm.
And so it actually started off as like I just want to create a measure that people can use that actually was normed and created for
Mm-hmm.
women of color. And so that started kind of my interest in this area. And then I was asked to be on like a research team with other colleagues around the
Okay.
country and sort of examining, body, like people who were scholars in body image with white women,
Mhm.
sort of wanting to understand the mechanisms with women of color. So that's how I got into it. And right now, my team is in the process of validate. So we created a measure that assesses body dissatisfaction with women of
Okay.
color that includes Black women, Asian American women, Latinx women, and as many as Native, Indigenous women as we have in our sample, which
Yeah.
is completely undercounted, of course. Um, but basically, those measures are created for those specific groups, and then we have also specific issues that come
Mm-hmm.
up. So, for example, eye shape is one of, we have like an eye shape scale
Mm-hmm.
for Asian American and Pacific Islander women. And we also have like hair concerns that's normed on Black women. So
Huh.
like our Asian, so the eye shape scale, or like, or this or satisfaction with eyes, right,
Mm-hmm.
is normed on Asian American women, could be used with all women, but normed on Asian American women because that's the group that tends to sort of disclose those concerns, right? Um, and so, and the same with hair form
Mm-hmm.
and hair, it's the Black women were the group that tended to really, those concerns sort of rose to the top when you're sort of thinking about what um, you're most uh, preoccupied with, or what
Yeah.
comes up. So I did it in a way that kind of flips it on its head, where instead of like, oh, here it's normed on white women, let's apply it to other groups, I'm trying to apply it to the groups it actually, or norm it to the groups that it actually makes the most sense with. So the factor structure, for example, for that scale is normed specifically to those groups. And those
Okay.
two, and then the other shapes like body shape, body size, those other ones are normed on all of the women of
Okay.
color. But
Because usually
yeah,
when we think of body image, we think of thinness versus your body size. And I know just on my very crude research and studies, I don't really study on it, but from what I've read up on the research on body image, they found that's usually white women who have had these issues, and that's with Asian American women. It's up and coming. There's a lot more body issues that's being reported. I'm wondering what have you found in your research, because it seems that it's more specific and really more nuanced towards those specific groups.
what I found thus far is that essentially, okay, so there's this hypothesis, especially for Black women,
Mm-hmm.
that says Black women are buffered against
Mm-hmm.
eating disorders and body dissatisfaction because in Black or African American culture, there's more acceptance of curvier
Mm-hmm.
bodies. Okay, so this has been sort of talked about because essentially the studies that found this are studies that include, ethnic minority groups with the white sample that they have. It's comparative, and it's really trying to predict eating disorder symptomology. Okay.
Right, right.
And one of the arguments that one of the hypotheses I had early on in this area was I don't think that there isn't some negative mental health outcomes happening. I think there are. It's
Mm-hmm.
just that we're focusing on the wrong thing.
Oh,
Because I
okay.
know that stress, for example, around hair is big for
Mm-hmm.
Black women, and stress around eye shape is big for Asian American women. And we're not actually looking at the aspects of body image that are the most pertinent, that can cause psychological distress or negative body image or body dissatisfaction. And if and it's not that I'm trying to find the negative things, it's that we can't say a group is buffered against something if we're not actually measuring the right thing. We want to help
Right.
all groups that are experiencing body dissatisfaction. It's just that body dissatisfaction looks different.
Right.
So
Right.
how do we intervene to lower body, you know what I mean?
Yes.
To
Yes.
intervene. I mean, we have to intervene and help. So
Yeah.
how do we deal with these different issues? And we have to acknowledge that they're different in the first place.
Right.
And oftentimes people are like, well, but the eating disorder symptomology is low. I'm like, that's nice, but that's not the point.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're in this Eurocentric, culturally racist space
Yeah.
in which like white, skinny, blue-eyed, blonde hair women are the epitome of beauty, and all of these other women don't fit into that. Can't
Right.
possibly. And most white women don't fit into that.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I mean, we have to address like what is the extra layer for women of color that really don't fit into these ideals.
Right.
Yeah. But so that's where that
Awesome.
came from.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate
Yeah.
it. What are some of so you talked about like for Black women, their challenges are with their hair in terms of body image, and Asian women, their eyes. What other challenges, what other unique challenges do you think other women of color you know may have when it comes to body image issues? I know with Filipino Americans, I think now, I don't have research yet to back this up. Maybe there's one somewhere. The noses,
Mhm.
because you want to have a nose that looks like our colonizer.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely face shape, like bone
Mhm.
structure. Also skin tone. Skin tone's
Oh,
huge.
yes,
And
yes,
so
yes.
that's the other major thing that is always missing. And a lot of people
Yeah,
kind of look at it as separate, you know, but and colorism is certainly an
yeah,
issue. But
yes,
also when we talk about beauty and body image, it's a huge issue.
yeah,
And and there's so many messages about skin tone within communities of color. So
yeah.
I think that's another huge one. You know, body shape, it really depends on, you know, the extent to which an individual internalizes like the white thin ideal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there's also some really great research. Evelyn Hunter, I believe, just came out with a scale of curviness that is
Okay.
meant to kind of flip this notion of like thin ideal on its head, because we also know there's ideals of curviness,
Mm-hmm.
and that doesn't really get talked a lot about. And I think that's really going to be really helpful for the field, to get at least like at a nuanced discussion of like body size
Mm-hmm.
and shape issues. So I'm seeing some great things coming out now, and you know, our my purpose in my research is just to try to figure out what those things are for groups. And I'm not an expert on all these women of color, for like that's not where I'm trying to come from either.
Mm-hmm.
I am all about like letting communities sort of you know, decide for themselves like what um sort of they find is important, or you know what they want solutions for. And certainly that's the case. I was just trying to disrupt the narrative that white middle class women were the ideal. And
Right,
when we
right.
talk about body image, all we know is really about what white women sort of experience, and try to apply that to women of color was just really irritating to me. So I just wanted to.
And thank you for your work, by the way. Appreciate that.
Thank you for asking me about it. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Um, what are some of the unique mental health challenges, if you do know, for Arab and Middle Eastern American folks?
That's really a great question. And I have so many amazing colleagues that are specifically, you know, in the field of counseling or clinical, that do, you know, active therapy
Mm-hmm.
and clinical work. Um, just in terms of cultural, you know, issues that might come up, I think, you know, sort of sometimes the mismatch, when you're talking about immigrants,
Mm.
mismatch of acculturation with parents, which again, similar to other groups, not maybe unique. Um, but also, you know, there's certainly communication style differences where
Mm.
you're not really able to um, speak explicitly about like what your individual needs are. And again, this is common in collectivist
Right,
cultures.
right.
Um, but just there are these interesting cultural norms that intersect with language and like use of metaphor that is pretty
Hmm.
interesting with Arab and Middle Eastern Americans, where you can't directly address something, but you do it through metaphor. So like
Okay.
really talented therapists can do that
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
Um, and uh, and I think it's incredibly important for this group that especially has so much stigma around mental health,
Mm-hmm.
and such a norm of keeping everything in the family, like never ever speaking out against like
Yeah.
having issues. So I think that becomes incredibly important. um I think they're again very similar in terms of like you see a lot of somatization.
Mm-hmm.
So not really understanding the mind body connection in the sense of when you're saying your stomach hurts or you have a headache, that could be signs of anxiety and depression and
Right,
other.
right.
So you see that, and one of the studies with my colleague Mona Amer, we found that for the Center for Epidemiological Statistics depression scale, that we saw a fourth factor emerge that was similar to other groups, that was just somatization of these kind of
Mm.
depression um, symptoms. And so I think it's still early to know what is really unique,
Mm-hmm.
and we are still sort of building the field in this regard. Um, Honestly, I just really want more data to be collected by folks.
Right,
So when
right.
you think about like, even when you think about like intervention effectiveness and empirically supported treatments and all that, like we just have so little with this
Yeah, I was gonna ask
population.
about that too. Yeah, and um, in terms of, I was gonna ask, do they even come to therapy if that's even, on the table? And do we have culturally sensitive clinicians, enough of them out there to be able to serve this community,
We're trying. I mean, SI is trying, right? So I mean, I think that's
Yeah,
one of the biggest missions, is to try to bring this group of scholars and practitioners
yeah,
together, because that's exactly what's needed. There's a really amazing study, the Healthy Mind study that comes out of the University of Michigan, that is a survey that's given to a whole slew of different colleges around the country, and they actually collected Arab and MENA data,
oh, okay.
and they found that Arab and MENA students are the lowest utilizers
Hmm.
of mental health services within the college setting, that also just report high levels of distress.
Hmm.
So this is an issue, right? The stigma is an issue.
Yeah,
And I think there needs also to be a lot of education within this community,
yeah.
about destigmatizing mental health. And at least now we have some data to start examining this.
I was just actually thinking when you're saying that, like, I wonder if there's a potential for like a webinar with like the all the emphasis, and that includes the SIP, the Latinx Psychological Association, Amina Psi, AB Psi, APA, kind of like to talk about, how we can combat the stigma in terms, in terms of mental health stigma. So I just thought that would be really interesting
Yeah,
to
no,
to
that sounds like
watch.
a great idea, and it's needed for sure.
Yeah. How am I doing with time? Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I'm really taking over a lot of your time. I have only two more questions.
Okay, no
So, how do
problem.
you think folks in the Asian American Psychological Association or the AAPI population in general can be better allies for the Arab Amina community?
Honestly, I really believe that um, the Asian American community has been amazing allies thus far, and just continuing that. I mean, really speaking up in spaces in which we're not there. And
Mhm.
I think that's really it for all groups. When we're not in the room, ask why we're not in the room.
Mhm.
Try to get us in the room. I mean, I think that's really what it comes down to. Kind of really trying to combat this invisibility. And I think we all can do that for one another in different spaces in which people sort of
Yeah.
believe that an issue is not really pertinent to one group over another. And that may be true in some respects, but if it's an issue, it's an issue and it should be
Mhm.
brought to light. So I think, I've a lot has happened, I would say, in the last 10 years, um, with Arab MENA
Mhm.
issues, and it's exploded in this really phenomenal way. And the only reason we are where we are now is from our allies.
Mm.
And I would say AAPA was absolutely one of those groups that helped us and spoke up and helped us have a seat at the table when we were missing. So I think um, we are forever grateful. And I think just continuing to speak up when you see any group is missing is really important.
Sounds good. And you mentioned that there a lot has happened to the Arab Middle Eastern group. Besides post 9/11, were there any other challenges that occurred that I may not be aware of?
Well, I was actually thinking of like how recognition has grown
Ah,
for this
okay.
group.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
like Division 45 of the APA added a slate for Arab
Mhm.
and MENA. That was huge. We created a MENA Psi, that was huge. Now, most recently, SEMA is adding an Arab MENA slate to their Committee of Ethnic
Mm,
Minority Affairs. So, like, really just beautiful, amazing things.
yes, yes,
Council has, MENA Psi included with the other EMPAs.
yes.
Like, so amazing things have happened that I could only dream of as a graduate student. So
Mm,
I am so happy that this is occurring, and so that's what I meant by that. But
okay.
the what we need is more research and more scholars and more clinicians, and we'll have more information to share. I'm sure, but there's a lot out there, certainly. And I think just the first step is just the recognition and
Yes.
acknowledgement that there's this group out here, and they're suffering these ways that are
Mhm.
similar and different than other
Yeah.
minoritized groups. Yeah.
Yeah, I can relate with, you know, having the seat at the table, and that's important. That's really, really important to have that recognition. So I think that's all of the questions that I have for you, and I really do appreciate your time. And I apologize for that technical glitch earlier. And yeah, that's it for me. Do you have any other questions for me?
I don't. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with
Of
you, and
course,
thank
of
you so much
course.
for having this podcast. It's
Of
amazing.
course. I will send you the link. I actually have to send the link to the other person that I interviewed as well, but I will send you the link once this is finished so that you can you can watch yourself. I try not to watch myself because I'm not a big
Yeah,
fan of
I
listening.
don't. Yeah, I can't do it. I just
No,
like,
me neither.
why do I talk so much with my face? I don't know.
But again, thank you so much, and I'm sure I'll be seeing more of you. We'll be
Yeah,
collaborating
no,
a lot more.
thank you.
All right, well,
I
take
really appreciate
care.
it. You too.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.